Ian Alstein again. Also, Ben, I'm curious about your thoughts on dialectical logic as a weapon to fight unitary concepts of freedom as a simply negative concept.
Wow.
Damn.
So real briefly, I think
Ben doesn't even do the courtesy pretend of like, oh, I don't really understand it, but I'll try. He's just like, yeah, I got it.
fuck yeah. So anyway, that's no, uh, no. So real briefly, I think that when the word uh, logic is sometimes used historically to mean a couple different things, that it's useful to keep separated. Um, so even if the sources you're using are using some of the same terms, they're using them to mean really different things, right? So I think like what's sometimes referred to as dialectical logic, I think might be more helpfully referred to as like dialectical methodology or analysis or something like that, right?
Logic.
Because logic, strictly speaking, is about consistency and how and whether or not the reasons you're giving to support what you're saying really support them, right? That's what it means to say, whether the premises that you're giving really add up to a good reason to believe the conclusion. And what dialectical methodology, as Hegel or Marx or Engels are talking about it, is really about is a certain method of analysis, particularly a certain method of analysis of historical processes, that's about looking at like opposing elements of things, not in the sense of two things that can't both be true. That'd be a logical contradiction, but in the sense of different elements of a system that are maybe pushing in different directions. So you can get, a sort of dynamic snapshot of it, right? You're not just thinking in terms of abstractions.
Like democracy, for instance.
Yeah, totally.
Right.
Like you're thinking about a dynamic system that is probably best understood. I think the question, there was something there about unitary conceptions of freedom, right? So like, certainly if you're thinking dialectically, you're thinking about, different features of a system that are in tension with each other, instead of just saying, the U.S. is a democracy, what are you complaining about? Or else sort of doing the like 16-year-old who's just read Noam Chomsky thing and, and being like, U.S. isn't a democracy, man. It's basically just fascist, right? Like that's instead of doing either of those things, right? You can say, well, you can have an analysis of the features of the United States, that a system that do give some openings for popular input and participation, and the features that are designed to discourage that, and how those actually interact with each other at any given moment in practice, rather than just as a timeless abstraction. So then you can think about what can we actually concretely do to make it, to expand democracy, which obviously
Cornel West does this exact move when he talks about the United States. He always talks about it as, on one hand, historically and continuously a capitalist, white supremacy driven empire, which obviously there's endless objective truth for, and then also a struggling republic and democracy, which has always either been manifested through, the extraordinary contradiction of the revolution itself that still advanced liberty in certain contexts, and then also the, people who have fought on the outside to expand it, from the suffragettes to A. Philip Randolph to Bernie Sanders. And that's the dialectical play. And this is a great example, though, of something that sounds super abstract, which is really important. If like it's and it goes actually back to why the atheism thinking really bothered me back in the day. Not that, again, I don't care if you're an atheist, whatever, believe what you want to believe. I'm not making that wrong one way or another, but just the idea that blanket statements that are ahistorical about huge historically contingent things lead to naturalizing them, whether we have a woke narrative or, much worse, a reactionary narrative. And so America, we have to say, it's an empire and it's a republic. It's a struggling democracy and an apartheid state. It's a social democracy. It's an innovator. It has an incredible melting pot. It's also a toxic consumeristic, like it's all of these things. And our task is to choose which way we go and fight for the right version of it. And basically, there's some version of that fight the world over. Yep. And that's why, you know, that's my tendency. Like, some people don't like if I put out like a, you know, a Hindu critique of the Modi project. They'll say it's essential to Hinduism what Modi's doing. And I guess, one, I generally don't believe anything's essential to anything, frankly, which sounds very abstract. But I also know on a practical level that there's going to be plenty of folks that identify with Hinduism, and it's really important that that democratic pluralistic argument come through it, as well as the Ambedkar, I'm going to just jet Hinduism because of the caste system. I highlight that argument too. I'm closer to that. But in fact, we need to, you know, I mean, you get what I'm saying. So
actually, if you're going to be an essentialist about any religious tradition, Hinduism is a particularly absurd one to be that about, right? Because, you know, you're not talking about like one relatively narrowly defined thing that's existed in that form for a long time. You're talking about a multiplicity of different traditions that was kind of given this label by external conquerors.
Right.
That was then really taken up in this interesting way by, you know, Hindu nationalists. But yeah, I mean, like the way that somebody like, you know, like Christopher Hitchens, who I know we all really admire the work that he did when he was at his best, right? But in the later part of his life that I think you're referring to, as far as atheism goes, I mean, I'm sure he was always an atheist, right? But like in the last decade or so of his life, when he was writing, you know, book, you know, like the subtitle of God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, right? You know, religion is just sort of this monolithic force that you almost would have thought like would have like dropped down from the sky like the black goo in the last Spider-Man movie, you know, that like, you know, like it's just you know, which actually is kind of the way, frankly, that at his worst, Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about racism and white supremacy. Like it's just this like evil force from, you know, beyond the stars or something, rather than something that evolved in a, you know, that evolved historically in a complicated way that existed in different ways at different times, and that there might actually be, you know, ways to push against. And
just to be really clear again, like there's political consequences to whether or not we take the Adolf Reed view or not. And if we don't, if things are just contingent and self-contained, and I got to be honest, there's days where I feel like that. I mean, there's days where it just feels like it's fucking doomed, whether we are talking about racism or capitalism or earth destruction or whatever else. But, you know, if we choose that, then we're done. So we also have to kind of like literally choose that not to.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.